The Great Hall of Prime was the largest structure in the known galaxy. It stretched for miles in every direction and held seats for thousands of representatives from hundreds of different species. The ceiling rose so high that clouds sometimes formed inside the building. Light from distant stars filtered through massive windows and cast long shadows across the polished floor. Ambassador Cole stood at the central podium and looked up at the assembled representatives. She was 52 years old with gray hair and tired eyes. She had served as Earth's voice in the Galactic Concord for 15 years. She had negotiated trade deals and resolved disputes and built relationships with dozens of species. She had believed that her work mattered. Today she learned that it did not. The representative stood on the opposite side of the hall. His name was High Speaker, and he was a tall reptilian creature with scales the color of dried blood. He had presented his case with confidence and arrogance. The claim that humans were their property. They said that thousands of years ago, long before humans had discovered fire, scientists had seeded Earth with genetic material. They called humans their lost stock and demanded the return of their investment. The evidence was obviously fake, had spent weeks proving it was fake. She had brought scientists and historians and genetic experts who all confirmed that humans had evolved naturally on Earth. The documents were forgeries created within the last century. None of it mattered. The representatives were not interested in evidence. They were interested in power. Commander Grant watched from the observation deck above the main floor. He was 34 years old with short brown hair and the build of someone who spent too much time in low gravity. He wore his Earth Navy dress uniform and kept his hands clasped behind his back. His fingers were shaking, and he did not want anyone to see. The vote began. Representatives from each species pressed buttons on their consoles, and the numbers appeared on a massive display screen above the hall. In favor of claims, against claims. The numbers climbed steadily and felt his stomach drop with each passing second. 400 species voted yes, then 500, then 600. The number against remained stuck at 12. When the final count appeared, had to read it 3 times before he believed it. 847 species had voted to enslave humanity. Only 12 had voted against. Cole did not move. She did not cry or scream or beg. She simply stood at the podium and stared at the number until her eyes burned. Then she spoke into the silence that had fallen over the hall. "You will regret this." Her voice was calm and quiet. It carried no emotion at all. High Speaker laughed and the sound echoed through the massive chamber. Several other representatives joined him. The laughter grew louder and louder until it filled the entire hall. Security officers approached the podium to escort away. She went without resistance. As she passed the observation deck, she looked up at and gave him a small nod. He understood what it meant. The time for talking was over. Admiral Henry Shaw received the news 3 hours later on his flagship in orbit above Earth. He was 61 years old with gray hair cut short and a face that had forgotten how to smile. He had commanded ships for 4 decades and had never lost a battle. He had also never faced a situation where fighting seemed impossible. His communications officer delivered the report with a trembling voice. Shaw listened without expression. When the officer finished, Shaw walked to the main viewport and looked down at Earth. Blue oceans and white clouds and green continents. Home to 9 billion people who had just been declared property. "Get me a secure channel to every human ship in the galaxy," Shaw said. "Every station and outpost and research post. Everyone." The officer hesitated. "Sir, the Concord will detect the transmission." Shaw turned and looked at the young man with eyes that had seen too much. "I do not care what the Concord detects." The recall order went out within 6 hours. Every human in the galaxy received the same message. "Come home. Bring everything. Tell no one." Ships broke from their stations without explanation. Scientists abandoned research projects. Soldiers walked away from joint operations. The galaxy watched in confusion as humanity simply disappeared. On Earth, President Maria Vance addressed the planet. She showed the vote count. She played recordings of the laughing. She let her people see exactly what the galaxy thought of them. Expected panic. He expected riots and despair and people giving up. Instead, he watched something else happen. He watched 9 billion people get angry. Not the loud kind of anger that burned itself out quickly. This was something colder and more patient. Across the planet, old enemies stopped fighting. Nations that had feuded for centuries put aside their differences. Political parties that had blocked each other for decades suddenly agreed on everything. They gave Earth 90 days to surrender. They gathered their slave ships at the edge of the solar system. Hundreds of massive vessels designed to transport billions of captives. Commander, the admiral in charge of the operation, broadcast daily messages reminding humanity of its new status. Earth did not respond, not once. Every communication channel went silent. No ships left the solar system. No refugees fled. No ambassadors begged for mercy. They interpreted this as acceptance. They assumed humanity had given up. They were wrong. Deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, Cole coordinated a project called Quiet Thunder. Scientists worked around the clock to reverse engineer every piece of alien technology humanity had acquired in 30 years of galactic membership. Engineers built weapons that should not exist according to galactic standards. Factories that had made consumer goods now produced instruments of war. Grant was assigned to special operations. His mission was to steal shield frequency codes from a trading outpost. The mission was supposed to be impossible. He would attempt it anyway. Admiral Shaw transformed Earth's small defensive fleet into something unrecognizable. Ships were rebuilt and upgraded and armed with weapons that broke every convention of civilized warfare. The Constellation, his flagship, was torn apart and reassembled 3 times in 90 days. Underground facilities across the planet produced millions of combat drones. Each one was small enough to fit in a human hand and carried enough explosive force to cripple a starship. Workers etched the same message into every drone. Remember the vote. On day 89, completed his mission and returned to Earth with the stolen codes. He found a species that had been transformed. The hopeful explorers who had joined the galactic community 30 years ago were gone. In their place stood something harder and colder and infinitely more dangerous. Cole sent one message to every human in the solar system as the final day approached. It contained a single word that had defined their species since the beginning. Fight. The fleet began its advance on day 90. 3,000 ships moved toward Earth with confidence and arrogance. They expected surrender. They expected submission. They expected to collect their property without resistance. They had no idea what was waiting for them. Commander stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the human solar system grow larger on his display screens. He was a veteran of 11 successful conquests and had personally overseen the enslavement of billions of beings. This operation would be the easiest of his career. The humans had gone silent for 90 days. They had not fought. They had not negotiated. They had simply stopped communicating and waited, had seen this pattern before. It meant acceptance. It meant a species had given up hope and was preparing to submit. His fleet of 3,000 ships moved in perfect formation through the outer reaches of the solar system. Each ship was armed with plasma cannons that could melt through hull plating in seconds. Each ship carried holding cells for thousands of human captives. They had been doing this for 4,000 years. They knew exactly how to break a species. On the bridge of the Constellation, Admiral Henry Shaw watched the enemy fleet approach. His officers stood at their stations in tense silence. 200 human ships waited behind the gas giants, hidden from sensors. 200 ships against 3,000. The math looked impossible. Shaw knew better. "Status report on the outer platforms," he said. His tactical officer checked her console. "All platforms armed and ready, targeting solutions locked, waiting for your order." Shaw nodded slowly. 90 days of work had produced weapons installations across every moon and asteroid in the outer solar system. They had not detected them because human engineers had built them to be invisible. The technology was crude compared to galactic standards, but it worked. Captain Grant sat in the cockpit of his fighter on the dark side of Neptune. His squadron of 40 pilots waited in the crushing atmosphere where no ship could survive. Human bodies had evolved on a world that was trying to kill them every moment of every day. They could endure conditions that would destroy other species in minutes. His communications panel flickered with a message from Cole. She was coordinating the defense from her bunker beneath the Rocky Mountains. Billions of humans watched the same screen she watched. They saw the fleet advancing toward their home. They waited for the signal that would begin the fight. The fleet passed Neptune without incident. They passed Uranus and detected nothing unusual. Commander grew more confident with each passing hour. The humans were not even attempting to resist. "Broadcast the final surrender demand," he ordered. His communications officer. The message went out on every frequency. It demanded that humans present themselves at designated collection points. It promised mercy for those who cooperated and punishment for those who resisted. It described the work camps where humans would spend the rest of their lives. Earth remained silent. The fleet passed Saturn and began its approach to the inner solar system, allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. This would be recorded as the easiest conquest in history. He would be celebrated as the commander who claimed the without losing a single ship. Then every human communication channel in the solar system activated at once. 6 billion voices spoke a single word in perfect unison. The sound filled every speaker and every console on every ship. It was not a plea or a negotiation or a surrender. It was a statement of intent delivered with absolute clarity. "No." Felt his scales tighten against his body. That was not the response of a broken species. That was a challenge. Admiral Shaw gave the order from the constellation. "Show them what 90 days bought us." Across the outer solar system, weapons platforms activated on every moon and asteroid. Thousands of installations that had been invisible moments before now filled sensor screens with targeting locks. The weapons they carried were not plasma cannons or laser batteries. They were gravity pulse generators that human scientists had invented by combining stolen technology with human creativity. The first volley struck the rear of the formation. Shields that had been calibrated to stop plasma fire collapsed instantly against weapons that warped space itself. Ships that had never been damaged in centuries of conquest crumpled like paper. Commander screamed orders to his fleet. "Regroup. Return fire. Identify the enemy positions." His officers tried to comply, but the humans were not fighting like any species the galaxy had seen before. They attacked from impossible angles and used tactics that made no sense according to standard military doctrine. Grant led his squadron out of Neptune's atmosphere and struck the command ships from behind. The shield codes he had stolen allowed his fighters to bypass defenses entirely. His pilots fired directly into engine cores and weapons systems. Each fighter destroyed targets 10 times its size. Cole coordinated the battle from her bunker. She had spent 90 days planning this moment. Every human ship knew exactly where to be and exactly what to do. They were fighting 3,000 individual engagements. Humanity was fighting one unified war. Millions of combat drones launched from hidden positions throughout the solar system. They swarmed ships and attached themselves to hulls. Some exploded immediately. Others waited until repair crews came to investigate before detonating. Each drone carried the same message burned into its hull: "Remember the vote." The formation broke within the first hour. Ships scattered in every direction trying to escape the massacre. They found no escape. Human forces had mined every retreat path with gravity weapons and autonomous weapons platforms. Tried to call for reinforcements. No response came. He tried to call for surrender terms. Admiral Shaw's voice came through his speakers. You voted to enslave us. You laughed when our ambassador warned you. The time for negotiation was 90 days ago. The battle lasted 18 hours. When it ended, the space between Neptune and Mars was filled with debris. 3,000 ships had been reduced to wreckage. Not a single vessel escaped to report what had happened. Commander died when his flagship was torn apart by gravity pulses. His last thought was confusion. The humans were supposed to be primitives. They were supposed to be easy prey. They were supposed to submit. On the Constellation, Admiral Shaw looked at the debris field that stretched across millions of miles. He felt no joy. He felt no satisfaction. He felt only the cold certainty that this was just the beginning. Cole broadcast a message to the Galactic Concord. Her face appeared on screens across hundreds of worlds. Her voice was calm and steady. That was defense. What comes next is something else entirely. Grant returned to the Constellation and stood at the viewport. He looked at the destruction humanity had caused and wondered what it meant for their future. They had proven they could not be conquered easily. Now they would prove something else. They would prove that humanity never forgot, and humanity never forgave. The galaxy had made a terrible mistake. They were about to learn exactly how terrible. The Galactic Concord held an emergency session 1 week after the Battle of Saul. Representatives from 800 species filled the Great Hall on Prime. They spoke in panicked voices and demanded immediate action. Humanity had destroyed an entire invasion fleet. Humanity had broken every rule of civilized warfare. Something had to be done. The conquered president was an ancient being from a species so old they had forgotten their own. She listened to the demands without expression. When the shouting finally stopped, she spoke. You voted to enslave them. You laughed at their ambassador. You sent 3,000 ships to claim them as property. Now you want protection from the consequences of your decision. The hall fell silent. No intervention will be authorized. You created this situation. You will live with it. 6 months after the battle, Admiral Henry Shaw led a fleet of 400 ships across the border into space. The ships were built from salvaged enemy technology that human engineers had improved beyond recognition. They moved faster and hit harder than anything they had ever faced. The first colony world surrendered without a fight. The planetary governor broadcast his submission the moment human ships appeared in orbit. He expected occupation and exploitation. That was how wars were conducted throughout the galaxy. Shaw did something different. He broadcast a message to every slave on the planet. We are here to free you. Anyone who wants to leave may board our transport ships. Anyone who wants to stay will be protected. They will never own another living being. 40 million slaves lived on that world. 38 million chose to leave. They came from dozens of different species. Some had been born in captivity and had never known freedom. They looked at the human soldiers with confusion and hope and fear all mixed together. Captain Grant commanded the Special Operations Division called Quiet Thunder. His teams moved ahead of the main fleet and struck military targets before the enemy knew they were coming. They destroyed shipyards and communication centers and weapons factories. They freed slaves wherever they found them. On the industrial world of, led 12 soldiers to destroy the largest shipyard in existence. The facility was protected by thousands of guards and security systems from a dozen different species. Standard military doctrine said the mission was impossible. Did not believe in impossible. His team infiltrated through the waste processing systems. The tunnels were filled with chemicals that would kill in seconds. Human bodies, evolved on a world where survival was never guaranteed, endured the toxic environment with only minor discomfort. They planted charges on reactor cores and slipped away before anyone knew they had been there. The shipyard exploded 6 hours later. 50 warships under construction were destroyed. The facility would take decades to rebuild. Commanders received reports of the attack and could not understand how 12 humans had done more damage than an entire fleet. Cole traveled across the galaxy as humanity's voice. She met with representatives from species who had watched the vote in silence. Some wanted to ally with humanity. Others wanted to understand what they were facing. All of them were afraid. She told them the truth. Humanity did not want to conquer the galaxy. They did not want to rule over other species or build an empire. They wanted justice. They wanted the slave trade destroyed forever. They wanted every being who had been taken from their home to be freed. "And after that?" asked a representative from one of the 12 who had voted against enslavement. Smiled, and there was nothing warm in it. "After that, we will have a conversation with everyone who voted yes." 1 year after the Battle of Saul, human forces had liberated 63 colonies. The slave population of the Dominion had dropped by 70%. Millions of freed beings had joined humanity's cause. They provided intelligence and support, and sometimes fought alongside human soldiers. The High Command gathered on there to discuss the crisis. They had never faced an enemy like this before. Previous wars had been fought over territory or resources or political advantage. Humanity seemed to want none of those things. They freed slaves and destroyed military targets and then moved on without occupying anything. High Commander was the senior military leader of the Dominion. He studied the reports with growing frustration. "What do they want?" he demanded. No one could answer. The humans did not behave like any species the galaxy had ever seen. They fought without mercy but treated prisoners with respect. They destroyed military targets but left civilian populations untouched. They seemed motivated by something beyond profit or power. Admiral Shaw could have explained it to them. Humanity wanted something they could not give. They wanted the vote undone. They wanted the laughter silenced. They wanted the galaxy to understand that human beings were not property. Since none of that was possible, humanity would settle for the next best thing. They would make certain no one ever made that mistake again. Grant's team captured High Commander on a secure military station 300 light-years from the station was supposed to be impenetrable, breached its defenses in 40 minutes. The trial was broadcast across the galaxy, was charged with slavery. He was charged with treating sentient beings as property. He was presented with evidence of every atrocity that had committed in 4,000 years of expansion. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Billions of beings across hundreds of worlds watched as the full scope of crimes was revealed. Slave camps and breeding programs and execution quotas. Species that had been worked to extinction. Children separated from parents and sold to the highest bidder. Was found guilty on all counts. His sentence was life imprisonment on a rehabilitation station, where he would spend his remaining years learning about the cultures his species had destroyed. Some thought the sentence was too lenient. Others thought it was too harsh. Cole did not care what anyone thought. The trial had served its purpose. The galaxy could no longer pretend they did not know what they had done. 18 months after the Battle of Saul, human ships arrived at the 800 vessels filled the sky above a planet that had never been attacked in its entire history. The planetary government looked up at the human fleet and finally understood what they had created. They had voted to enslave a species that did not know how to surrender. They had laughed at a woman who had promised consequences. They had dismissed warnings from creatures they considered primitive and weak. Admiral Shaw stood on the bridge of the constellation and looked down at the billions of beings lived on that planet. Most of them had never owned a slave or voted for anything. They were simply citizens of a civilization that had made terrible choices. Shaw opened a channel to the planetary government. You have 24 hours to surrender unconditionally. Your military will be disbanded. Your government will be dissolved. Every slave in your territory will be freed. This is not a negotiation. The government took 12 hours to respond. They surrendered. Cole watched the surrender broadcast from her ship in orbit. She thought about the day she had stood at the podium and warned the galaxy. She thought about the laughter that had followed. She thought about the 90 days of silence that had preceded the storm. They had learned their lesson. Now it was time to teach the rest of the galaxy. They had never known occupation. For 4,000 years they had been the conquerors and the masters, and the ones who decided the fate of lesser species. Now human soldiers walked their streets, and citizens learned what it felt like to be powerless. Admiral Henry Shaw established his headquarters in the former Senate building, where the vote for Earth's enslavement had first been proposed. He sat in the chair where leaders had made decisions about billions of lives. The chair was too large for his human frame, but he did not care. The symbolism was more important than comfort. Captain Grant commanded the security forces responsible for maintaining order across the planet. It was difficult work. Civilians were confused and frightened. Some wanted to fight. Others wanted to cooperate. Most simply wanted to know what would happen to them and their families. Gave them the same answer every time. You will be treated better than you treated your slaves. That is the only promise humanity makes. Cole arrived on the 1 week after the surrender. She walked through the capital city without guards and looked at the faces of beings who had voted to enslave her species. They avoided her eyes. They stepped aside to let her pass. They had learned to fear the creatures they once dismissed as primitive stock. The dismantling of the government took 3 months. Human administrators worked with moderate citizens to establish a provisional council. Former slaves were given positions of authority. The beings who had once been property now helped decide the future of their former masters. Some could not accept this change. They organized resistance movements and attacked human patrols. They planted bombs in public spaces and spread propaganda through underground networks. They called on their people to rise up and reclaim their rightful place as masters of the galaxy. Grant's forces dealt with them efficiently. The resistance fighters expected torture and execution. Instead, they received trials and imprisonment. Human justice was different from justice. It was fair and consistent and applied equally to everyone regardless of species. This confused them more than anything else. The Galactic Conquered watched these events with growing alarm. Humanity had destroyed the military and occupied there and dismantled their government. They had done everything the Conquered had feared when they first encountered the 30 years earlier. An emergency session was called to discuss intervention. 800 representatives gathered in the Great Hall on Prime. They debated for days about what should be done. Some demanded military action against humanity. Others argued for diplomatic solutions. A few quietly suggested that perhaps they had deserved what happened to them. The Conquered president listened to every argument. Then she made her decision. The humans have not attacked any species except They have not demanded territory or resources from the broader galaxy. They have not threatened any Conquered member who was not directly involved in the enslavement vote. She looked around the hall at representatives who were trying very hard not to meet her eyes. Until humanity threatens Conquered members directly, no action will be taken. The representatives protested loudly. The president ignored them. She remembered watching the original vote and feeling sick at what her fellow species had allowed to happen. She felt no sympathy for the now. Cole prepared her address to the galaxy. She spent weeks crafting every word. This speech would define humanity's relationship with other species for generations to come. She stood in the burned remains of the Senate chamber surrounded by holographic cameras. The seats where representatives had voted for Earth's enslavement lay empty, and by weapons fire. Behind her, human soldiers stood guard in silent rows. 30 years ago, humanity joined the Galactic Concord. We were young and hopeful and naive. We believed the galaxy operated on principles of fairness and justice. We believed civilized species would treat each other with basic dignity. She paused and let her gaze sweep across the ruined chamber. We were wrong. When they claimed we were their property, 847 species voted to enslave us. Only 12 stood with Earth. The rest of you either supported our enslavement or watched in silence while it happened. Across the galaxy, billions of beings listened. We do not blame the 12 who voted against. The Fornax and the others showed courage when courage was costly. They will always be counted as friends of humanity. Her voice grew harder. To the 847 who voted yes, we have a different message. What we did to we can do to any of you. We do not want to. We did not come to the stars looking for enemies, but we will not be enslaved. We will not be conquered. We will not be property. Admiral Shaw watched the broadcast from his headquarters. He had approved every word. He knew some species would see this as a threat. He hoped others would understand it as a warning. The Galactic Concord failed humanity, continued. It was supposed to protect member species from aggression. Instead, it legalized our enslavement because they had more political influence. A system that allows such things to happen is not worth preserving. She took a breath before delivering the final part of her message. Humanity proposes a new order, a new alliance based on genuine cooperation and mutual protection. Any species that wishes to join may apply. Any species that threatens a member will face consequences. We will not stand by while innocents are enslaved, as you stood by when it happened to us. The broadcast ended. The galaxy processed what they had heard. Within days, 43 species formally requested membership in humanity's new alliance. Most were smaller civilizations that had lived in fear of expansion. Some were former slave species who had nowhere else to go. Admiral Shaw retired from active command 6 months after the surrender. He had spent 2 years fighting a war he never wanted. He had destroyed thousands of ships and ended millions of lives. He had done what was necessary to protect his species. Now he wanted to rest. His last official act was to establish a memorial on the. It listed the names of every human who had died in slave camps over the centuries. Thousands of names carved into stone that would last for. At the base of the memorial, Shaw added one final inscription that he had written himself. They thought we would break, they were wrong. Grant visited the memorial on the day it was completed. He read through the names and thought about what each one represented. A life cut short, a family destroyed, a future stolen by beings who considered humans nothing more than livestock. He made a silent promise to every name on that wall. Their sacrifice would not be forgotten. Their deaths would not be meaningless. Humanity would build something better on the ashes of the old order. Cole joined him at the memorial as the sun set over the Capitol. She looked tired but satisfied. They had accomplished what many thought impossible. They had freed millions of slaves and broken the most powerful slave empire in galactic history. What happens now? Asked. Looked up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Now we build. We create something the galaxy has never seen before. An alliance based on respect instead of fear, justice instead of power. She turned to face him. And we make sure no one ever forgets what happens when you push humanity too far. 10 years had passed since the vote that condemned humanity to slavery. The galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Dominion existed only in history books. The Galactic Concord had dissolved and been replaced by the Stellar Alliance. Earth had become something it never expected to be. The center of galactic civilization. Grant stood in the Alliance Assembly Hall on Earth's moon and watched representatives from 97 species debate trade agreements. He was 44 years old now. His military uniform had been replaced by diplomatic robes. The scars on his hands had faded but never disappeared completely. He preferred keeping the scars. They reminded him of what humanity had survived. The Alliance operated on principles the old Concord had ignored. Every member species had one vote regardless of size or military power. No species could be declared property of another under any circumstances. Any attempt to enslave a sentient being would result in immediate military response from all Alliance members. Some species had called these rules arrogant when humanity first proposed them. Now they were simply the law of the galaxy. Cole served as the Alliance's first Secretary General. She had not wanted the position. She had spent years as a warrior and revolutionary and looked forward to quiet retirement. But humanity needed a face the galaxy recognized, a voice that other species associated with both justice and consequence. She gave them that voice every day. Admiral Henry Shaw lived on a small farm in Montana, surrounded by mountains that reminded him of the endless void between stars. He raised animals and grew crops and tried not to think about the war. Some nights he succeeded. Most nights he did not. Visitors came occasionally. Former officers who wanted to pay respects. Historians who wanted to record his memories. Young cadets who wanted to meet the man who had broken the fleet and reshaped galactic civilization. Shaw welcomed them all and answered their questions honestly. "Do you regret any of it?" a young officer asked him one evening. Shaw thought about the question for a long time. He had killed millions. He had destroyed entire fleets and brought down an empire that had stood for thousands of years. He had turned humanity from hopeful explorers into something that made ancient civilizations tremble with fear. "I regret that it was necessary," he said finally. "I do not regret that we did it." The young officer nodded and seemed satisfied with the answer. On the former, a new generation was growing up without slavery. Children learned about their ancestors in school and struggled to understand how such terrible things had once been normal. Former slaves held positions in government and business and education. The transition was not easy, but it was happening steadily. Visited the once each year on the anniversary of the surrender. He walked through the capital city and observed how much had changed. Buildings that had once housed slave markets now served as museums. Streets named after famous slavers had been renamed to honor those they had enslaved. A young stopped him during his 8th visit. She was barely an adult by her species standards. "My grandmother was a slave handler," she said. "She supervised work camps where humans died. She told me stories before she passed, stories about how she treated the workers." Waited for her to continue. She said she never thought of them as people, the humans. She said it was easier to do the work if you did not think of them as people with lives and families and hopes. The young looked at him with eyes that held no hostility. "How did you think of us during the war, when you were destroying our ships and conquering our worlds? Did you think of us as people?" Considered the question carefully. It was the same question he had asked himself many times over the years. "Yes," he said, "every single one of you. That is what made it so difficult, and that is what made us different from the we were fighting." The young woman nodded slowly. She seemed to understand. The memorial on Earth's moon grew larger every year as researchers discovered records of more humans who had died in captivity. The current count exceeded 50,000 names. Suspected the true number was much higher. He attended the memorial ceremony on the 10th anniversary of the vote. 97 species sent representatives. They stood in respectful silence as Cole spoke about sacrifice and survival and the cost of freedom. "We did not choose this path," she said. "We would have preferred peace and cooperation and a galaxy where species treated each other with basic decency." She looked at the assembled representatives. But we were not given that choice. When the galaxy voted to enslave us, we had two options: submit or fight. We will always choose to fight. The ceremony concluded with a reading of names. It took 4 hours to read them all, stayed for every minute. A young species approached the Alliance that year seeking membership. They called themselves the and had achieved only recently. Their representatives were nervous and hopeful and completely unaware of galactic history. Met with them as part of the admission process. He explained the Alliance's rules and answered their questions about trade and defense and cultural exchange. They listened carefully and seemed satisfied. At the end of the meeting, their senior representative asked a question that surprised him. "We have heard stories about humans, stories that seem impossible. They say your species destroyed an empire and reshaped the entire galaxy in a single generation. They say other species are afraid of you." Smiled gently. "Some of those stories are true. Our species was once marked for enslavement by a powerful civilization. We fought back and won. The details are in our historical archives if you want to know more." The representative hesitated before asking another question. "The stories also say that humans never forget, that you hold memories of wrongs done to you for generations, that anyone who threatens your species will face consequences eventually." Thought about Shaw on his farm and in her office, and the 50,000 names carved into stone. "We remember," he said. "We remember everyone who stood with us and everyone who stood against us. We remember the 12 who voted no and the 847 who voted yes. We remember our dead and we remember those who killed them." He leaned forward slightly. "But we do not hold grudges against species who treat us with respect. We do not punish children for what their ancestors did. We do not seek conflict with those who wish to live in peace." The representative seemed relieved. "Then we have nothing to fear from humanity." Looked at the young alien with eyes that had seen too much to offer false comfort. "You have nothing to fear," he said, "as long as you remember one simple truth about our species. We are kind and generous and creative. We prefer friendship over conflict and cooperation over competition. We will help any species that asks for our assistance." He paused. "We are also capable of ending civilizations when we have no other choice. Do not mistake our kindness for weakness. Do not assume our patience means we will accept mistreatment." He extended his hand in the human gesture of greeting. "Others made that mistake once, only once." The representative took his hand. His species joined the Alliance 3 months later and prospered under its protection. In the archives of the Alliance, the record of the original vote was preserved forever. 847 names listed under one heading: those who forgot that humanity was not property. 12 names listed under another heading: those who remembered. The galaxy had learned its lesson. Humanity made certain they would never forget it. And somewhere on Earth, in a quiet house in Montana, an old admiral looked up at the stars and allowed himself a small smile. They had won. They had survived. They had built something better from the ashes of what tried to destroy them. That was enough. That would always be enough.